I found myself very interested in science and mathematics, and spent a lot of time in the basement of the old library ferreting out old issues of Scientific American that had interesting articles in them. I wanted to contribute something to the world of knowledge. When Sister Adams and I married, we decided to try to make our decisions about what we would do for school and where we would live, and we tried to follow a pattern of fasting and prayer and making those decisions. And eventually this culminated in pursuing a PhD in material science. I learned how to get inspiration and revelation from the Lord in my scientific career. And electron microscopy became a part of the contribution that my students and I would make from our laboratory. We invented together a new form of electron microscopy that became known as orientation imaging microscopy. And it had a great deal more information in it than ordinary microscopy had. This is a three-sided version of this. The colors are false, but the colors are coded back to a three-dimensional characterization of the underlying crystal structure of the tiny grains that make up the microstructure of the material. They are obtained from electron microscopy, and the inspiration that came to us from the heavens was how to index these patterns automatically. We were able to develop computer algorithms that would orient the crystal, and this information was coming from a tiny, tiny little spot on the surface of a sample. And that information is three-dimensional information mapped onto a surface. There were about 250 scientific papers that we published, but there was one. And this book that we wrote has been used as a textbook in many places, including MIT. And one wonderful day, President Eyring came down to BYU, and he wanted to talk to research-oriented faculty, and so I was selected to go and meet with him. And he said in that occasion, "Why can't undergraduates publish papers in the very best scientific journals?" So I decided to try this, and 12 years later, there were 25 young undergraduate students at BYU that I was able to tutor, all of whom went on to do PhDs, and all of them published papers in the best scientific journals, and they wrote those papers. So that wound up being my greatest source of joy and accomplishment. So my parents were Mac and Margaret Adams. My mother was from Spanish Fork, Utah, and she was a Larson, and my father was born in Kanab. His parents moved up to the Bingham Mines when he was young. They were great people. My father was a school teacher, and my parents had 10 children. I was the oldest of them. And they lived a very humble and modest life in Heber City, where I grew up, which was a great place to grow up. Instilled in all of us an understanding of what it meant to work hard. We had a large garden, and it was an important resource. And we kept a pit where we had potatoes and apples and carrots and those things that you can store through the winter if you keep them cool. And my parents were completely faithful to their covenants. They had been asked by President Joseph Fielding Smith, when he sealed them in the temple, to have as large a family as they could have, even if it meant some risk to my mother's health. She was quite frail. And they did that, and they had 10 children. Well, I think of one experience in particular that happened in the mission field. And I wound up in France and Switzerland. And midway through my mission, I served in a place called Besançon. And things were really rough there. It was, we were cold and wet and sick much of the time. And we were ditched by our most promising family that we were teaching. And then we were chased by a dog, and I got knocked down a stairwell, bruised and battered, but not hurt that much. But that evening, I remember just pouring out my heart to the Lord and asking Him if I was doing the right thing. And the Spirit came into the room and filled me from head to tail. And I knew that the Lord knew me and knew my name and was pleased with what I was doing. And that was the experience that has stayed with me all of my life. Another experience I remember is deciding I was going to turn my life over to the Lord and see if He could make something out of me. I was a young professor. I was down in Florida at that time, teaching at the University of Florida. And I remember going out into a field where we lived and kneeling down and saying, Lord, you know, I've got a lot of problems, a lot of faults, and I don't know what you can do with me, but if you can do anything with me, I commit myself to pass through whatever experiences you need me to go through to do that. And that was a turning point in my life. Learning to receive revelation was an important part. We would reach a point in our research where things weren't so clear. Through prayer and seeking, the heavens would open. And I remember sitting down once. I happened to be on a trip into St. Petersburg, Russia, for a conference. I remember sitting down and for 2 hours just receiving direction from the heavens about a research problem that I was working on. And I filled up 4 or 5 pages of my notebook with the ideas that came, and that wound up turning into about 15 different scientific papers over time as I shared those with students, and we worked on them and worked on the direction it was given. And that happened, that kind of thing happened many times during my career. My wife and I have been blessed to be able to serve 4 senior missions together. And the prompting came to retire, and I wasn't ready to retire. I hadn't even been thinking about it. But by then in my life, I knew that I needed to act on promptings like that. So we immediately jumped into that preparation and started to put our missionary papers together and wound up over in Russia together and serving a 2-year-long mission. We had a prompting to move to Cedar City after our first mission, and that's how we wound up down here. Second mission, New Hampshire, a completely different experience there, just as wonderful as our first. Our third mission was into Massachusetts. And I was walking home from the temple here, and the Spirit stopped me and said, Brent, I need you to serve another mission. Well, I've thought a lot about that. And I know that we were all witnesses of the Lord in the premortal world. But I'm now able to bear a testimony that's a little bit deeper of that, because I have seen, I've lived long enough now, experienced enough in life, through my eyes, through the eyes of others, to know that Christ was completely successful in completing His glorious atoning sacrifice. And I now know that there is no pain that is suffered in mortality. There is no imprisonment. There is no addiction. There is no circumstance of hurt that the Savior is not able to heal and release and overcome. He was completely successful in his atoning sacrifice for us. And all we have to do is be willing to yoke ourselves to him, and he shows us the way out of those things. And I've experienced that for myself. I especially love lamb tagine. Learned to love that in Marrakesh in Morocco, and I feel a special kinship with the Nauvoo Temple. I love Fyodor Dostoevsky. I also came to love Victor Hugo, and especially his Les Miserables. From 1 Nephi, chapter 17 and 18, the story of building the boat, and the metaphor, the powerful metaphor that is there of building our families piece by piece, sealing them together into a ship that must cross the great deep and weather the storms. Hymn number 81 hit me like a ton of bricks one day in a sacrament meeting.